The job of a therapist is to do a deep dive into patients' past traumas, unconscious conflicts, and family history in order to understand their current beliefs, feelings, and behaviors that may block them in their current life. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani expertly does this every day in her private practice. Grace Smith accesses this subconscious part of a patient through a very different door. As a certified hypnotherapist through the International Association of Counselors and Therapists, Grace has changed lives by treating anxiety, smoking cessation, chronic pain, and more. In this series, they discuss how to fix subconscious blocks to overcome mental health issues. Welcome, and thank you for being here,
My
Dr.
pleasure,
Ramani.
thank you.
And welcome back, Grace Smith.
Thanks for having me.
Certified hypnotherapist. I want you to start by telling us this great story about Alex.
Absolutely. So it was very early on in my career as a hypnotherapist. In fact, I was still only doing it part-time. I still had a career in corporate America. And at that point, I'd been helping people with some more superficial seeming issues, things like nail biting or overcoming fear of flying, things that weren't necessarily debilitating all day long in every way. And then I got a call to help this man named Alex. And he had been a United Nations peacekeeping officer in Syria, one of the Blue Berets. So this man was a warrior. He was hand chosen by the government of Brazil to represent his nation in Syria, one of the most dangerous places in the world. So one day, his United Nations convoy is crossing the city of Damascus and is stopped at an uncharted blockade. And he looks outside his window and there's a bazooka pointed straight at him. And in that moment, his last thought was, this is it. It's over. He blacked out, woke up 10 days later at a hospital in Lebanon to find that he had not lost his life, but he had lost his life as he had known it. He was now paralyzed on the left-hand side of his body. And so in that moment, he had suffered a stress-induced stroke, and now this warrior, cut down in his prime, couldn't move a muscle. So after 4 months of every type of specialist attempting to help him, he was flown to the Rusk Institute in New York City where I was working. And it was there that I was asked if I would be able to help him with his now debilitating depression. Again, I hadn't worked as something to this magnitude yet. And my honest answer was, I have no idea if I can help him, but truly, what do we have to lose? So I remember going into the Rusk Institute. It was very intimidating for me, being so new at this. White coats, surgeons, fluorescent lighting, this man with suicidal ideation, again, cut down in his prime. And I remember looking at him lying in his hospital bed and my saying, Alex, this is going to be unlike any therapy you've experienced thus far. You're going to close your eyes. I'm going to help you relax. It's going to feel like you're in a meditative state, and we're going to have a conversation. And we'll see if we can help alleviate some of this depression. So halfway through this session, I get this thought in my head, Grace, he's military, be militant. Now, I call hypnosis meditation with a goal. And you'd never think to be militant in meditation. So it really felt like divine inspiration to some extent. This was not part of my training. But I said, okay, he's military, be militant. And I became more forceful and I said, Alex, I want you to begin to imagine you're flying over a city at night. You're in a helicopter. You can see a topographical map of your brain, and that's what you're flying over. You can see where the lights are on, where the electricity is working. And you can see where there's a blackout, where the electricity has stopped working. Fly to where there's the blackout and let me know when you're there. And he did. And I said, when I count down from 3 to 1 and snap my fingers, there's going to be an explosion where that blackout once was. 3, 2, 1. And he flinched. And I said, now that electricity travels down the left-hand side of your face, travels through your left arm, travels through your left hand, and travels out your left finger. And I hadn't even finished the word, and he was moving his left finger. So his eyes shoot open, and he looks at me and he says, what do I do now? And I just look at him and I start crying hysterically and said, just keep moving your finger. That's it. Wow. So by the end of that day, he had this much range of motion when he had once been paralyzed. And that was the day I put in my 2 weeks notice in corporate America, and I said, people are suffering needlessly. This man went from being paralyzed to having mobility in his left hand because he visualized moving in his mind from the theta state. And of course, the very best part of that story is I ended up marrying Alex's son. That's how I
worked out
met who would become my father-in-law.
Fantastic.
Yes.
As a clinical psychologist, Dr. Ramani, how do you respond to that?
So what's so interesting is knowing that, when Grace is a hypnotherapist, is that that's obviously not a form of therapy clinical psychologists would traditionally be trained in. If they chose to get that training afterwards, they would. But to that story, there's a couple of responses I have. Is that one is I want to say cynical part of my mind, but the part of my mind that was trained with a wider lens, that just out of the hypnosis space, is that you created tremendous trust and rapport with this individual. And in that space of safety, things were made possible. And then pulled on other very, very important techniques, which I think we should be building into therapy more. Back when I got trained, we didn't do this, which was the use of meditation and staying in the moment. So that use of that technique is something I think all therapists should be doing, which is in that moment, using sensate focus, having people focus on whatever it is they do, literally doing that work in the moment, in the therapeutic room. It shows the potency of that. And so I think that, obviously it's like, that's a very specific space, but I think that they're the techniques we all use as therapists, but most of all, it's the rapport in the safe space.
Grace, how did you become a certified hypnotherapist?
Absolutely. So I used hypnotherapy to quit smoking. I was very young and had recently gotten sober, and 6 months into my sobriety was still chain smoking cigarettes, 24 years old, living in the Lower East Side with a very stressful corporate job. Someone recommended hypnosis. I went in with my arms crossed, totally resistant, not thinking it would work, but truly I was at my wit's end. And that's how most people come to hypnotherapy still. It is still viewed as a last resort. And then I used it to overcome a debilitating fear of public speaking. And when I saw this track record with two totally unrelated things in my life that had been causing so much unnecessary pain, not to mention how costly the smoking was, and really, truly how much the fear of public speaking was costing me in my career advancement, I just said, I have to understand more of what this is. Why is it so powerful? Why is it non-invasive? Why do people think it's clucking chickens and swinging watches when actually it's fascinating and I feel amazing when it's over, but most importantly, it's effective. So that's when I went and got the certification. To be perfectly honest, hypnotherapy is wonderfully powerful, but it is not yet regulated. And the education is not where it needs to be at all.
And that's what I was reacting to, is that there's a lot of people out there who are touting it. I don't know what it is they're doing, but they're also not always informed as to other things like around psychodiagnosis and other comorbid conditions. Then they may end up steering back into a traditional therapist's office. And, and that could happen with anybody, like, in any unregulated discipline. But in the same breath, if you look at the empirical research, the research on hypnotherapy and smoking is incontrovertible, and that's the recommendation I will always make to a client who's struggling with quitting smoking: hypnotherapy first.
Really?
Yes, because it's where the evidence. See, I'm an evidence-based kind of gal.
Yes, I know.
You know that about me. So from that place, I was like, it's a no-brainer. Like, this is non-invasive. They're not putting more, nicotine and stuff in their body with gums and all that. They can actually, and it works. I mean, and there's a good research base for that. But even, to your point, Grace, which is so interesting, you say, we think of hypnotherapy, we think of watches going back and forth and all that. Let's go back to the very beginning. Like him or not, Freud changed this field. He made this field, whether we want to own that or not. It's like two people in a room and something happens. But what was he doing? He was people were getting into such a relaxed state that they started to talk. And so when you think of where Freud's practice began, sort of the release of what we call more somatic conditions, but he used to call it hysteria. People who would claim they were paralyzed in their foot, or they were frozen, or they were hysterically blind. They weren't blind, they could see. And when you look at Freud's early writings and all of his early case studies, it was the relaxation the client was put in, talk, and then the release. And I'm still convinced it wasn't the early childhood work they were doing, the early conflicts. It was the relaxation, talk. And that's what was releasing the symptomatology.
What I'm hearing is that the advent of what we now know as therapy and psychology had influence of what we now know as hypnotherapy.
100 years ago. 100 years ago. Yeah. That's really where it all began, because Freud's mentor was a guy named Charcot, and Charcot, and even before Charcot was a guy named Mesmer, mesmerized, it all came from that name, yeah. That Mesmer and Charcot were hypnotherapists.
Wow.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, that was his original training.
So how does hypnotherapy work?
Just as Dr. Ramani said, it is powerful because you are deeply relaxed. So here's what happens. Most people attempt to change their life, to develop new habits when they're already in survival mode, when they are in fight, flight, freeze, stressed out mode. That is when you are the least adaptable. That is when you are the least open to change. That is when you are the least open to hearing new information. So if we were to put sensors on our heads right now, we would be producing what's known as beta waves. So they're pretty fast, they're spiky, they're close together. That's normal waking consciousness. If we were to stop talking and just sort of look out the window for a little bit, start daydreaming, that would be alpha. That's a little bit smoother, slower. That's the light bulb moment in the shower. Way down here is delta. Delta, you're not conscious, right? But your subconscious is very active because that's sleep. Now, hypnotherapy and deep meditation both take place at what's known as the theta brainwave state. Theta is deeper than alpha, deeper than daydreaming, but more alert and more conscious than sleep. So people mistake hypnotherapy for sleep. It doesn't help that stage hypnotists scream sleep at people. All they're doing is telling you to close your eyes. But you are in this unbelievably deeply relaxed place. And what we have found from the research thus far is that you are open to suggestion when you feel that safe and relaxed, but also you have the surplus energy required to create new neurological links in the brain much faster than when you're in survival mode and totally depleted of any surplus energy. And so that's why we can see transformation so rapidly.
So when we're able to access that subconscious part of our brain, I understand how we can make changes. From a mental health perspective, what types of mental health disorders could we target when we really target the subconscious part of our brain?
One would argue, theoretically, any.
Any. Okay.
I mean, there's nothing we couldn't address in that, right? Because, again, a riff back on Freud, if so much of mental health issues are a byproduct of unresolved stuff. I'm not even going to call it conflict, but unresolved stuff. A subconscious state then would allow a person to go into that stuff. Look at some of the practices you have now around trauma therapy, which I know we've had MedCircle series on things like EMDR and things like that. EMDR, once again, is really about getting a person into a place where they can look at that early stuff, like bringing it up, getting the person to go there, and then doing an intervention around that. Now, listen, if I was sitting here, if you had in my chair right now a radical behaviorist, they would be poo-pooing both of us, both Grace and I, saying that this historical stuff really doesn't matter. It's all, I could, this, in fact, you know this better than we do, having worked with animals. You could shape any behavior in a living creature through the reinforcements you give them at that time. And that's what a behaviorist would argue, and they would say, I don't see that they see no function of a subconscious, that they're like, it's conscious reaction to reward and then how a person learns and shapes a new behavior. But other than that, I think most of us would agree that there is something that is not addressed, that is uncomfortable, that is being pushed away. That is often, it's the backdrop, it's the context, it's the thing that is often explaining a lot of this way. So traditionally in therapy, what do? We listen to a person's story really deeply, and we help them draw connections. It's so interesting, you choose women who da-da-da-da-da, when you just told me your mother da-da-da-da-da-da, and they'll say, I never thought of that.
Right.
You know why? Because it's their story. It's harder for them to parse it away. So your short answer to your question, I would say any.
Now, when we talk about hypnotherapy or in mental health, which I guess now may be one and the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
We talk about limiting beliefs. I want to start with Dr. Ramani. What is a limiting belief?
So a limiting belief is a thought that a person holds about themselves or about the world that restricts their range of behavior. The most obvious limiting belief, and most of us have, is I can't do that. Okay, I can't cook dinner. I can't ride a bike 10 miles. I can't talk to a stranger. you don't do it. Okay? So, but those are thoughts, and they're words that you happen to be listening to and behaving in accordance with. So that's really what a limiting belief is. It's a thought, usually translated into language, that impacts our behavior and limits our behavior.
Grace, is that your definition as well?
Absolutely. And in the subconscious, we're not even aware of what our limiting beliefs are. So I'll give an example. There was a woman I helped overcome addiction to sugar. She thought she ate sugar because she liked sugar. She thought she ate sugar because her coworkers put out M&M bowls on their desk every day, and she just didn't have the willpower to say no. So we go into the subconscious and we find that one of her happiest childhood memories is her baking with her grandmother, because she had a very tumultuous upbringing. And so even though from a resource perspective, her subconscious was saying, when you need to feel love, like the love of your grandmother, which was the only unconditional love you received, and it's important for you to feel that way, we're going to link it to sugar. So every time you're feeling upset and sad, you're going to go grab for that sugar. It was a limiting belief, because then she couldn't stop eating sugar. When she was older, she had no control over it. And so by going into the subconscious, we could see, wow, she's got this limiting belief that sugar is love, is grandma. It's totally combobulated, and we got to separate these things and put sugars over here, and here's why it's not good for you. Grandma's here, and here's why that love is so important. And what I find is the three biggest limiting beliefs that are at the root of everything are lack of self-love, lack of self-worth, lack of self-confidence. And her inability to generate her own self-love meant she was constantly, even as an adult, seeking that love of her grandmother. So once we got those three things in place, she didn't want the sugar anymore, and there's been 3 years without it now.
I am fascinated by this idea of our subconscious limiting beliefs, and it reminds me of a story Dr. Judy told me in a series that was very similar to the one you just said. I want to toss that right now for our viewers. Take a look at this.
So I had a patient who really had a huge distaste to one of the national food chains, and there wasn't really any reason for it other than, oh, I just don't like the food. I mean, he didn't really even necessarily connect that it was related to a trauma memory. And through some of our work together, eventually it comes out that that was where he learned that his parents were getting divorced. And so he didn't necessarily recall it even at the time. It was really through our work that he organically kind of came up with this, you know, after 8 months of therapy.
So then how did his life change once he realized where that strong reaction was coming from?
Well, it's interesting because I think for him, he realized, oh, it's not really the restaurant, but it's like obviously the memory that's associated with that restaurant. And so for the first time in 10 years, he actually went to eat at that restaurant. And it was a really interesting experience. Like, he was eating a burger and crying. I mean, he had like a really rough time there. People must have looked at him and was like, what's going on? Like, you're like eating a burger and crying. But after he allowed himself to sort of process that, there's now no necessarily negative reaction to it. I mean, it's not his favorite restaurant, but he'll eat there. It's not a big deal. But it was just really interesting that all these years he had suppressed it. And he had the surface level of like distaste for this place, but he didn't know why. And then once he connected that memory, he was able to kind of face that. And then he was able to really move that off of a sort of physiological state of mind where whenever he gets near that restaurant, he just has a bad feeling.
I shot a series on acceptance and commitment therapy with Dr. Judy, and it seems like there's a lot of overlapping here with hypnotherapy. What is ACT?
So acceptance and commitment therapy is, you know, and I was talking to some folks earlier today, it's when existential therapy has a bit of a fling with cognitive behavioral therapy.
That's so
you know,
perfect.
and I said it a bit dirtier with them.
Yeah,
I mean, it's really, it's existential techniques, humanistic techniques, frankly, meet a cognitive behavioral, a little bit of mindfulness thrown in. So you're taking in a lot of the stuff that we know are some of the most profound active ingredients in a lot of evidence-based therapies. I like a lot about acceptance and commitment therapy for the two parts of the acceptance and the taking action part, okay? But the real winning part to me of acceptance and commitment therapy is this idea that life is actually uncomfortable. It really is. And to get to a life that enacts your meaning, your purpose, your core philosophies, it ain't gonna be easy. And then what it allows you to do in therapy, and this is almost much more behavioral, so like I said, it takes in from a lot of theoretical schools, it begs the question of what are you moving away from and what are you moving towards? What we do as human beings, unfortunately, is we move away from pain. Now, at some level, that's adaptive, right? We'd never want to keep our hand on a burning pot. That's great. But we treat psychological pain like that burning pot.
Right.
And so what we then do is spend all our waking hours dodging pain.
Don't we, though?
And then there's no time left to really be in line, integrated with our core philosophy and values, because we're spending all our time avoiding pain, right? And so what happens is we give so much meaning to the pain, and I can't be in the pain, to which this model is saying, accept the pain. And again, you know my work, a lot of it is on narcissistic abuse, and for a lot of my clients who came from toxic family systems, the big day is when they accept, like, this is what you came from. And it's a bummer. And I know you wanted it to be a loving, happy family. It's not what you got. Okay? And that, though, does not define you.
Right.
You can accept this and then look at your life as the damn triumph that it is.
Yeah.
And so that's where the acceptance work then becomes part of this journey. Is hard. But if you are aligned with your core philosophy, who are you?
Yeah.
What are you about?
Yeah.
What do you stand for? That you will somehow be able to get yourself to that other side with that acceptance. And then another big part of the model is that mindfulness work, is that ability to be in the moment and let those thoughts come at you and simply, or feelings come at you or sensations come at you, and be with them. And so that combination of techniques of paying attention to what you're moving away from, because you're wasting time there, because then you're not moving toward your discomfort with pain, the acceptance of pain, the mindfulness techniques, and then also the observing self. Looking at yourself from here, using language differently. And what acceptance and commitment therapy really gets at is this idea that language imprisons us. If I walk around saying, I am disorganized, that means I am disorganized. Like, that's my identity. But even a little trick of the word, as it were, to say, I have the thought that I may be disorganized. All of a sudden, it's not Ramani has brown eyes. It's not Ramani's disorganized. It's like, that enters the realm of possibility. I have the thought that Ramani's taken on too many responsibilities. Oh, whoop, there's another thought.
So good.
All of a sudden, just through a trick of language. Do this with my clients all the time. Just say it with me once, and they're like, ooh. And it was just words. Just words.
And instead of those words controlling you, you are now controlling the words.
That's it.
Last night, I was having a real big moment, my own personal crisis, and I went back to that. And I said, I am having the thought that blah, 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 blah. And it took me a little bit out so I could see what was going on, feel what was going on, and so I could process it in a way that felt more healthy. Grace, when people hear about hypnotherapy and they say, no, thank you. I'll take some crystals to go as well. No, I'm not doing any of that stuff. It's nonsense. It doesn't work. What do you say to them?
I say, well, here's the thing. And this is what I tell my students, because we actually created our own certification school for hypnotherapy to make sure that we do up the standards for practicing members of this field. And I say to my students, we're not evangelists, okay? It's not our job to go out and convert people into people who want to do hypnotherapy. It is our job to show up and be as professional as possible and help people who are seeking help. And because people come to hypnosis as a last resort, they eventually find us if something else didn't work along the way. But there's also so much wonderful research coming out. So, for example, there was a study from Stanford that found that women with metastatic breast cancer, the group that did hypnotherapy had 50% less pain during their treatment than the control group. But at a 10-year follow-up of the same group of women, those who had done hypnotherapy had twice the survival rate. And this is out of Stanford. And another study from Harvard Medical School showed that those who did hypnotherapy as compared to the control group, when they had an ankle fracture, at 6.5 weeks, they were showing 8.5 weeks of healing. So bones were healing 40% faster.
But were they doing hypnotherapy for that specific thing?
Visualizing the healing of their ankle fracture.
Okay.
40% faster. And there's just so many studies, there's no convincing. You either want to do it and you look at the empirical data of this is absolutely effective and can help you, or you don't. And if you don't, there's no convincing you, and that's not my job.
I like that a lot. What about things like, you mentioned smoking and weight loss? How does hypnotherapy affect those?
Well, what's interesting is you can be working on anything. And I think that's why people have some trouble with it. It kind of sounds like snake oil, right? How could something that helps you with weight loss also help you with nail biting, also help you with not screaming at your kids at night? And I understand that confusion, but here's how it works. In the subconscious mind, it stores all of your habits, all of your beliefs, and all of your emotional responses. It also holds your digestion, right? These automatic bodily functions. So for example, when you get nervous because you're about to go on stage and speak and all of a sudden you have a tummy ache, these are subconscious things that are happening, but they are linked. So when you access the subconscious mind by entering into that relaxed theta state, what we do is something called reframing. So let's say with smoking, or there's two main things that we do. There's a lot of them, but the two main ones are reframing or parts therapy. So with smoking, you go in and you talk to the smoker, the part that is smoking, because there's a part that doesn't want to smoke. I don't understand.
What do you mean I go into a hypno state and then I talk to the part of myself that is a smoker?
Yeah, so basically when you're in that meditative state, it becomes like a negotiation. And the hypnotherapist would say, I'd like to speak to the part of you that is the smoker. And in the same way that you just had that trick of language where you said, I'm having the thought that, and it created separation, this does the same thing. You're not a smoker. Right. There's a part of you that is the smoker. Let's talk to it. And then you can understand why the part thinks everything the subconscious does is because it thinks it's keeping you safe. Its job is to keep you alive. But oftentimes what that means is keeping you small and keeping you doing the same things you've always done, right? So if you've always been smoking and you're alive and breathing, the part that is the smoker thinks you're doing great, right? It's accomplishing its goal. So you get into the subconscious and you say to the smoker, actually smoking is hurting me X, Y, Z in all of these different ways. I'd like to do this instead. And it actually is a negotiation. And you have to replace the old habit with something new. You can't just give up smoking because then the subconscious will come up with another way to keep you safe that you might not want. So for example, you replace smoking with sipping water. Because if you don't, it will probably replace smoking with eating food. That hand-to-mouth thing will just happen naturally, right? So you replace it with something that serves you. With weight loss, this is a whole wonderful field, and I've got a book coming out on this soon too. But primarily, the two main issues that we're facing are the fact that serotonin is released when you eat fatty, salty, sugary foods. And so when you're sad, feeling depressed, or anxious, the body wants to keep you safe by releasing these feel-good hormones into your body. So that's one thing. The other thing is the perceived rewards that you receive from eating the way you've always been eating. So here's an example. Studies have found that as many as 80% of obese women were sexually abused as children.
Whoa.
So there's a subconscious belief that the bigger I am physically, the more safe I am, because the more invisible I become to predators. So the perceived reward of eating for this person is so high, it keeps them safe, it keeps them alive, that there's no just do a keto diet that's going to help this person. So you have to access the subconscious and find out, what does the overeater believe is the perceived reward of eating in this way, and then you have to negotiate a new way of being.
Right. Now that makes a lot of logical sense to me. As a doctor and as a psychology expert, how do you respond to that?
So I think that, in some ways it completely is in line with any of us who do health behavior change research, right? So anybody who is eating well past the point of being fully satisfied, anyone who is knowingly engaged, there's not engaging in unhealthy behavior. There is not a single person on this planet who doesn't know smoking is unhealthy. The messages have just been too pervasive, right? It's not like it was 50, 60 years ago. We're like, oh, is this really dangerous? Everybody knows. So people are knowingly doing something that's harmful or not doing something for its biological reason. So it's sort of like, it all becomes, we call it sort of the backstory issue. What contextually has happened? What are the associations with food? My first book was on emotional eating.
Yeah, you are why you eat.
Exactly, and that everybody, as I put it, has a dinner table story. It is where most of the pathology of a family unfolded, whether you ate alone, whether you ate and got screamed at, whether you watched your mother restrict food, whether you got called fat, whatever it was, that dining table, that dinner table, eating table, kitchen, whatever you want to call it, is a very loaded place and set the tone. So it's unearthing that back story, which is such a part of most therapists. I say most because the behaviorists are just going to take it straight up without the historical piece. But for the rest of us, we do dig deep and look at the meanings of things. So that's what this feels like to me. Just it's a different kind of a frame than I think we would call it, that those of us who do more sort of traditional talk therapies, as it were, that it is that we may not call it going into the subconscious, but I view all therapists of every stripe to really be archaeologists.
Yes.
Here's your psyche, and
Yes.
let's start digging. And then before you know it, we get to the pottery shards and we get to all this other stuff and we lay it out and I'm like, what is this?
Yes.
And then we start putting it together. Oh, it's an old ancient dish.
Right.
And in your case, it's your ancient hurt.
I love that.
Beautiful
I'll give
said.
a quick example. So my smoker part thought it was keeping me safe because it believed, I had no conscious awareness of this, but it believed that when I would smoke walking down the street in New York City, that it made me less approachable to cat callers and men. So its perceived reward was that it was keeping me safe, not that it was destroying my lungs and my pocketbook and my fingers. So until we had that discussion, it actually thought it was helping me. And again, no conscious awareness of this.
I have a lot of questions for the two of you. This is so freaking good. It's so fun to have a hypnotherapist on one end, a clinical psychologist on the other. We're going to get to all those questions and more in our next session.